Hey everybody, Dawn Zoldi here, CEO of P3 Tech Consulting. I'm so excited today to introduce to you this incredible panel. This panel involves security and a holistic view about energy infrastructure. It originally aired live, if you will, in person at the 7th Annual Energy, Drone, and Robotics Coalition Summit. We did our first ever Law Tech Connect Energy Edition there, and it was so good and we didn't have a videographer that I gathered the team and said, we need to go out there and do this live. So without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce you to Mary Caitlin Ray from the law firm of Crowell, who's going to go ahead and moderate this panel and introduce the rest of the guests. I'm going to fade to the background and see y'all later.
Thanks, Dawn. And hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this panel on a holistic firm of Crowell & Mooring in Washington, D.C. I work with clients who are using drones for their businesses, including clients using drones to inspect or secure critical infrastructure, and other industry stakeholders that manufacture or provide related services for unmanned aircraft. Prior to joining Crowell & Mooring, I worked as an attorney in the FAA's Office of the Chief Counsel, where I advised the Next Gen and UAS program offices, including serving as counsel to the UAS and UAM integration pilot programs. I'm standing in today for my colleague, Tyler O'Connor, a partner in our energy and government affairs groups. He led this panel when it was presented live in Houston, but was unfortunately unable to join us today. So I'll do my best to fill his shoes. I'm joined today by our three panelists, Tom Adams, Trent Teyema, and Jacob Canter. I'll let them each introduce themselves, starting with Tom. Go ahead, Tom.
Hey, good morning. My name is Tom Adams. I am the CEO of AeroVigilance and the co-architect of C-UASHub, which is a counter UAS news information website, and formerly with the Department of Justice, working as a program manager in their counter UAS program. It's great to be here. Thank you.
All right, Trent.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for having me. I'm Trent Teyema. I'm president and founder of CSG Strategy, based here out of Washington, D.C. My firm specializes in cybersecurity, counter threat. I have a long-term background, retired from the FBI, where we focused on counter threat and cybersecurity issues related to edge devices, such as drones.
Great, thanks. Jacob?
Thanks so much, Mary Caitlin. It's really nice to be here. My name is Jacob Canter. I'm a lawyer at Crowell & Mooring, and I sit in the San Francisco office. I work on privacy and cybersecurity, and I work in a litigation practice group. I work on incident response with large and small companies and on issues that we're going to be talking about today, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thanks, all. So let's dive right in. To set the stage, in 2018, California was set ablaze in what became known as the Camp Fire. 85 people died, entire towns were destroyed, and the utility adjudged to have caused the fire, PG&E, ultimately went bankrupt. It became the most expensive natural disaster in history in terms of insured losses. Criminal investigators ultimately attributed the start of the fire to an old, worn-down hook on the Caribou-Palermo transmission line, which both PG&E and the California Public Utility Commission had overlooked in the course of inspections of the PG&E system, often done by helicopter. We can't know for certain, but the deployment of unmanned aerial vehicles to inspect the transmission system just might have saved dozens of lives and billions of dollars. 4 years later, Russia invaded Ukraine. In the course of the war, Russia has repeatedly used Iranian-made Shahed drones to dive bomb and debilitate Ukrainian power and grid infrastructure. And Ukraine, for its part, appears to be defending itself by deploying drones to strike deep within Russia, including through alleged attacks on Russian oil pipelines. These two cases, while extreme, illustrate both the promise and the peril of unmanned aerial vehicles and their potential impacts to energy infrastructure. But they only scratch the surface. As our panelists will describe here today, the proliferation of drones can bring immeasurable security benefits, but they also pose physical and cybersecurity risks, as well as implicate significant privacy concerns. Fortunately, Jacob, Tom, and Trent are here to help us navigate those issues, including the threats posed by UAVs, the legal authorities and limitations governing the use of UAVs, and key operational considerations for the use of drones. So with that, let's discuss the drone and cyber threats that are keeping our panelists up at night. Tom, why don't you start us off? Since this is a panel about securing energy infrastructure, what are the primary physical threats posed by the use of drones, both malicious and unintended?
Well, first of all, sleep is apparently overrated because I don't get much. There's can manifest themselves around critical infrastructure. One of that a lot of people mention is the careless and clueless. And one thing to keep in mind too is that a lot of the airspace over critical infrastructure is not restricted, and so you do have a lot of pilots that will fly over it, not really understanding the potential security risk that they may be presenting or the potential safety risk to some of the individuals below. And one of the things that's very difficult to determine is what people's intent are that may be flying around. But when it comes to the threats to critical infrastructure, it could be something as nefarious as using drones, like what you'd mentioned before with Russia and Ukraine, where they could use drones to debilitate or to take some of their critical infrastructure grid offline through physical attacks. They can be used to monitor your traditional physical security measures. So like if I were to do some sort of a Ocean's 11 sort of attack on any entity, I was looking to breach their physical security infrastructure, I would probably use a drone to monitor the physical security measures and to find maybe some areas where there might be some vulnerabilities that I could exploit, or I might use it as the intelligence and surveillance platform while I'm conducting some sort of an attack. They can be used to, but they're basically flying cameras for the most part, so they can be used to certainly, steal company proprietary information. They can be used as a delivery tool for a cyber hacking tool, which I'm sure someone else will mention too. But it's really going to be up to the creativity of the people that are looking to conduct the activity. It's kind of similar to the IED fight back in the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, where really the perpetrators that were using IED and their tactics varied based on some of the things that we did on our end to prevent those things from happening.
And Tom, what steps might they take to shore up their physical security?
Well, I think one of the big pieces is having airspace awareness. I mean, the days of gates, guns, and guards are really long gone at this point, and we have to start thinking about that third dimension, which includes having some airspace awareness. And a lot of times, we have some great security training, technology, procedures, but a lot of times we're not really looking to see what's going on in the airspace above us. Big step, but technology is not the only thing that is going to solve this problem. I really think it takes a more holistic approach that includes maybe some physical protection measures, secure your facility or the things that are the assets that you're trying to protect, because technology is not going to be the only thing that you can do. Policies, procedures, and training are going to be another big part of that too.
Sure. And how do you see the threat profile changing over time? Are there emerging threats that energy infrastructure is not yet equipped to handle?
That's a really good question. I think when it comes to our critical infrastructure, even the energy infrastructure, I think a lot of entities understand that this threat is evolving and that it's coming. But from a fiscal standpoint, I think they understand it's maybe a top 10 priority, but it's maybe not as high of a priority right now that they want to start investing significant amounts of money until we can kind of get some more rules and regulations and standards that may be relevant before they start investing in that type of stuff. But I think we have a long ways to go. We do have a very vulnerable infrastructure, and I think we need to start thinking about where this threat is coming from. And we've kind of been isolated from a lot of the different conflicts from around the world, but I think we need to realize that when it comes to unmanned or uncrewed aircraft systems, is that those things can be launched from 20, 30 miles off coast. They can come from quite a ways away, and so we need to really be keeping a close look on how this threat is evolving, what the ranges and distances and capabilities are, because I think that we're a little bit more vulnerable than maybe what we think.
Thanks, Tom. Trent, for those in the audience who aren't ensconced in drone cybersecurity issues, can you tell us at a high level why this is a critical consideration for drone operators?
Oh, sure, absolutely. So cybersecurity is absolutely essential because every drone is basically an edge computer and you're remotely controlling it. So you basically have a flying computer set that you can either put a camera on, you might put an antenna on, you might put other sensing gear for imaging, hyperspectral, sniffing. And so, but it's taking all that information. So the command and control is all done digitally. Now, whether that's by wire or that's by wireless, that's why it's such a critical thing. So the three ways to hack a drone: you either do it yourself, so you're trying to disable some of the hard-coded GPS or flight restrictions. Somebody intercepts it, so it's like data in transit. So I overpower it, or I confuse the GPS, or I target the drone operator, the base station. And so it's so critical because depending on where these drones are flying and around what, if they are to interfere with any of their components, may cause a bigger health safety problem. So it's really a big deal as you're going into it. And then finally, even more like right now, one of the questions here in the US is, where did the chips come from? And, is it this type of chip or that type of chip? Are there backdoors hard coded into it that allow you to take advantage of that device?
And that's very, very timely topic right now, right? The manufacture and distribution of these chips. Jacob, I know you're also active in the cybersecurity space, and you help companies in a range of industries anticipate cybersecurity incidents and responses by engaging in tabletop or other types of exercises. How, if at all, should drone operators think differently about cybersecurity incidents and their response preparation relative to other industries? To say it another way, is there anything unique about the use of drones that impacts the way companies should think about cyber incident response?
Thanks so much, Mary Caitlin, for the question. It's a really good one. I think drone operators need to think differently about cybersecurity than other industry for at least 3 reasons. First, you need to have a plan to access the device that is attacked. That's just not a problem for static hardware systems that most industry deal with for attacks. If there is an attack, you may need to access the device manually to perform some actions on it, such as pulling hardware from it or turning it off. Planning for how to do that needs to be part of the incident response strategy. Second, you need to look at the FAA regulations and guidelines to determine whether that agency needs to be notified of the cyber attack. A lot of companies do not interface with the FAA, but as you all may know, the FAA plays a large role in regulating the use of aerial devices. So notice might actually be required, but also just might be a proper and useful sort of action to provide notice to the agency to protect your own systems, to protect others, and to limit overall potential liability. So you need to know how to contact the agency, who in the agency is the right person to contact, and how to properly describe the incident so that you get a proportionate response to the problem that has come up. And then third, you actually, in some circumstances, have different and potentially a broader set of means to identify the threat actor. This is related to what Trent was talking about in very general terms. When there is an incident, you identify the threat actor through a vulnerability that has been exploited, and then you can triangulate to the threat actor source through IP address information, activity patterns that reflect threat actor operations, or of course, if the threat actor makes a demand and identifies themselves. But when it comes to drone activity, the threat actor could be using a device that requires direct line of sight to the device to operate. In that case, you aren't looking around the world for a threat actor, but you might be looking in the vicinity of where the drone attack actually occurred. This can expand, but also complicate the investigation that your company completes in tandem with law enforcement, but also raises the potential to actually identify the threat actor and potentially seek compensation for any damage that has been caused.
Thank you, Jacob. Really complex issues that companies need to be thinking about in terms of their cyber incident response. Trent, when we were chatting in Houston on this panel when it was live, you had emphasized the importance of communication security. Why is that so critical for drone owners and operators, and what can companies do to protect against these threats?
It's very important because it really goes down to the command and control of the drone, and you're working it. So it's either going to be wireless or wired. So it's going to be a tethered drone or wireless drone, and the wireless is either going to probably be Wi-Fi, maybe Bluetooth, but it could be cellular. And if we stick to the wireless communications, it's a point of attack. So what I'd go in and do a spoofing attack. I try and impersonate the base station, ground station pilot to take control over it or overpower it so that my signal is closer, stronger, so the drone thinks that it's getting commands from a legitimate user. And then depending on those different signals or frequencies, so whether Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, or cellular, they all present range and degradation issues that you have to keep in mind. So what drones you're going to use, how are you going to use them, and then how do you secure it? So a lot more of these, we've learned this hard way through experience over the last 10 years, both here domestically and overseas, like with the military, intercepting or overpowering it so you have that communication channel encrypted, so it's only accepting commands from a legitimate source. Those, especially when you're operating around near infrastructure or sensitive areas where you don't want the device to crash, you don't want to lose control of it, and a lot of concerns that get out of the FAA, because that same communication, it's that same channel that you're going to be bringing data back. And so that's why it's really critical that you control that drone. And mainly we're talking line of sight, but it's especially important if you're doing beyond line of sight. So, hey, that pizza's trying to get there, but I lose it, and now I lose control of that device, and where's it going to go? Pizza maybe not so bad, but if you have a lot of equipment or something really sensitive and it flies into someone or something,
Sure.
That could be bad.
And what about data protection? Drones are obviously capturing and storing a lot of sensitive data. How can companies safeguard that data, and what can you tell us about the rules and regulations governing the protection and storage of that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I don't think a lot of people are putting a lot of thought on this. So you've got your drone, you're collecting it, you're flying it around where you're trying to collect information on, whether it's through imagery, hyperspectral, or other sensing, and it's coming back. It's most likely being transmitted back in the clear. So somebody could intercept it and take that information from you, because whenever you encrypt something, you compress your signal strength and what you can transmit. But coming back, where that data is, so you have data in transmission, but then you're getting into data at rest. So how sensitive is that data? Is it sensitive to your operations? Do you want other people to have access? Is that just going into a hard drive on the portable device, laptop, tablet, or is it going into another, and it's sitting on your truck and you're just driving around with all this really critical data? There's probably not a lot of thought into protecting that. Now, there are a lot of overlaying regulatory agencies that may govern it, because privacy, depending on where you collected, how you collected, and the person coming in may have an expectation of privacy. And I'm just keeping in the US context. If you're in the European Union, now you got GDPR and all these other overlays. So that's just how you handle it. Then finally you bring it back to your company or how you're doing it. You're going to want to protect that information, because then that becomes proprietary, maybe even trade secret, on telling you what is going on that somebody could use against you, either on how to bid, like if you're agriculture, how much you can bid per bushel for wheat, or if you're a methane, it may indicate areas where you have leaks that you want to try and address to get ahead of it, so somebody else doesn't use it against
Sure.
you.
Now, drones obviously utilize firmware and software in order to be able to operate, and both can pose vulnerabilities that can be exploited by bad actors. Have we seen attacks against drone firmware and software? And when we talk about malicious cybersecurity attacks on a drone system, are we primarily concerned about state actors, non-state terrorist organizations, hacker collectives, or the proverbial man or woman in their garage? And Jacob, also, feel free to chime in on this as well if you have any thoughts.
Well, yeah, the short answer is that yes to all those, because so a state actor is going to be very sophisticated. That's where you're going to build it into the chip or into the device. You have a backdoor that allows somebody to log into that device, which creates more of a target of opportunity. But there's plenty of sites out there where somebody can download, what we call a wares kit, so you can hack, or, just download the application and then remotely hack drones right now. So depending on the motivation, they may want to get in there and disrupt what you're doing because they don't like how you're overflying your infrastructure. And it's all about the motivation, because honestly, if you're a hacker, the tools and techniques are exactly the same. It all comes down to motivation and how much resources you have to it.
I agree with everything Trent said, and I'll just add that in the traditional paradigm, the hacker is somewhere else, not direct line of sight to the product, not accessible immediately. In the drone context, the hacker might be someone that came upon the device through direct line of sight, has physical access to the device, and might have the ability to manipulate the device in ways that aren't generally available in the sort of traditional hacker sense when they're coming through the device sort of from an extraterritorial location. So while all of the factors that you need to keep in mind with firmware and software security remain in place for drones, there are additional ones you probably need to keep in mind too.
Just to add to that a little bit, I mean, this is where we're kind of getting, it's interesting. So depending on who's flying the drone, the conversation, it used to be that the conversation surrounding like tethered drones was like, okay, it's really limited because they're tethered and you can't really do as much with it. But if you're like emergency services or you're in a sensitive area, the tethered, where you have the communication going up and down the cabling and the control, if you're in what we say a semi-permissive or non-permissive environment where there are people attacking it, that's something to keep in mind, because you have more secure control of how the drone operates and what you collect.
And weaknesses.
So, I mean, as we're dealing with the drones
moment.
and how you attack them, that's where you're really coming into it. Oh, sorry, she's back.
Oh, you lost me? I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Could Tom hear my question? Sure, yeah. Tom, what are some of the main counter UAS technologies and what are their relative strengths and weaknesses?
So, of counter UAS technology includes, you divide them into detection and mitigation, or some people call it detection and effectors. On the detection side of things, the four main categories are radar, EOIR cameras, acoustics, and then radio frequency detection technology. I believe Jacob's going to probably dive into a little bit more of the legal aspects, so I won't go into that too much. And then on the mitigation side, you have kinetic and non-kinetic mitigation technologies. An example of a kinetic mitigation technology might be a net or a hunter capture drone, or some sort of a munition or airburst munition that might take out the drone that way. Every type of equipment, whether it's detection or mitigation, has its strengths and limitations. Whether it's line of sight issues, they could have radio frequency interference issues. Maybe they work better in some environments and not others. And so, it's really important that, if you're going to look on the technology side, that you really take some time to look at what your user requirements are, and maybe it would be good to chat with somebody that can help you to define those user requirements, because the technology is evolving very quickly, and there's some great capabilities out there, and kind of understanding what the landscape is very helpful. But then the other piece of it is just making sure that it's going to fit for what you want to use it for. Is it going to work in your environment? Are there going to be some other issues or concerns you might need to take into consideration before you make that sort of an investment?
Sure. So it sounds like there are some technologies that are best equipped for detection and others that are better equipped for mitigation. Can you discuss that distinction and how you would advise companies to mitigate physical threats when seizing or exercising control of an aircraft without authorization that violates the federal law?
Yeah, if right now there's in the U.S. there's only 4 federal agencies who have any sort of statutory relief from disrupting, disabled, or destroying aircraft that are believed to be a credible threat. That's DOJ, DHS, DOE, and DOD. If it's not one of those federal agencies, I'm not going to have any advice on that. That's something that they should speak to an attorney that's a little bit more experience on those kind of matters than what I am. I will say that when you do conduct mitigation operations, legal mitigation operations, there's a lot of risk to not only the critical infrastructure or assets that you're trying to protect, but also to the risk of the public, the communication spectrum, and the national airspace. And so it's it's one of those things that is regulated very carefully and for very good reasons. I know a lot of us in the industry are looking forward to the eventual expansion of not only detection and mitigation authorities, but it's got to be done very carefully, because if we do it incorrectly and not keep in mind some of those risks and do work through the risk mitigation process, it could be we could be doing more harm than maybe what the drone would be doing itself.
Sure. Now, Jacob, could you elaborate on some of the legal concerns that Tom just highlighted and the potential penalties for violating those laws?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm just going to echo Tom's point that for federal agencies themselves, but also for private actors, the federal government carefully regulates the use of counter-drone technology. And while I don't want to be definitive, I can say it is hard to imagine a use of counter-drone technology prior to consulting with at least your in-house counsel, if not also your outside counsel, on whether the use is legal. And for all the reasons why Tom explained, there's a real reason for this. It's the sensitivity of the impact that might occur when using the technology, and the importance of making sure that the mitigating intent is not cause more problems than the hope. So as a private actor, there's a number of federal laws. I'm just going to walk through a couple of them. There's sections 301 and 302A of Title 42 that prohibits you from developing, testing, or operating a jamming device absent authorization from the FCC. There's section 377 of Title 42, and that prohibits you from maliciously or willfully interfering with an FCC authorized radio communication. Now, just to pause on that one, it raises some questions for me. For example, how would I know whether or not a drone flying on my private property is FCC authorized? And wouldn't it be reasonable for me to think that a drone attacking my property is not FCC authorized? But putting those questions aside, they're difficult and very fact specific, and you'll certainly want to be consulting with counsel and having a strong understanding of the facts on the ground before pursuing any action. So there's the Pen Trap Act, that's 18 U.S.C. 3121. It provides you cannot use or install a device that records or captures dialing, routing, addressing, or signaling information. This is a broad and older statute that was initially passed to address devices literally installed onto hardware like phone booths. But the language is broad, both in terms of what is covered by the device and the capture provision. So you want to tread here carefully. And then there's the Wiretap Act, that's 18 U.S.C. 2511 and 12. So that prohibits the interception of private wire, oral, and electronic communications. So that's similar to the Pen Trap Act, but it actually covers communications that are in transit. So I think it's pretty clear how a counter-drone device would potentially fall under its purview if the function of the device is to intercept, halt, or change communications to a drone from the drone operator. So that's sort of a very brief overview of the federal landscape of laws that regulate your use of counter-drone technology, but there are similar laws on the state and local level as well. Like the federal ones, these don't expressly cover the use of counter-drone technology, and they might not expressly even mention drone technology, but they're broad enough and they relate to similar types of technology that you'll need to think carefully before pursuing any action to make sure that you don't run afoul of these laws.
And are there any preventative measures that private companies can take against cyber threats?
Yes, I mean, there's certainly there's certainly a lot of work that you can do as a private company to make sure that your technology is protected. excuse me, there are devices you can work with vendors that work in the counter technology space, in the cybersecurity space, and they can help secure your technology to make sure that it's protected from cyber attacks. This can include an analysis of your technology to identify any vulnerabilities, and then also recommendations for products you can buy that will secure your devices, or changes to your own internal practices to make sure that you don't expose the vulnerabilities more than is necessary. Another important and common step that people take is just monitoring the presence of vulnerabilities that are identified. You can monitor this. This is publicly accessible information, and you'll want to make sure that if you are possessing sensitive information, and sensitive can include information that's business sensitive or sensitive in terms of the personal information that people possess, then you can have a way to protect that and know about the changing risks associated with its exposure. And finally, and I could talk about this more later, you can also just have a plan, and you'll want to make sure that you have a plan if and when it occurs that there is an incident that arises, so that you can limit any exposure and risk and consequences that arise from an attack that does happen to occur.
Thanks, Jacob. I'm cognizant of our time here, so let's move on to operational considerations. Tom, several years ago, the FAA solicited comments on its eventual use of remote ID for unmanned aircraft systems. I think the agency received well over 50,000 comments in response to the proposed rule. This was one of the largest rulemakings in the drone space since Part 107. So it was very highly anticipated. And given that we're nearing a major compliance deadline for remote ID this September for drone operators, can you elaborate for us on what remote ID is and why the FAA has considered it such a high priority?
Yeah, thank you. So remote ID, the successful implementation of remote ID will set the stage for more more complex drone operations in the national airspace. And essentially what it is there are some exceptions, but beginning September 16th, drones are generally required to broadcast certain message elements that are able to be received with remote ID receivers, whether it's a smartphone or some other type of receiver or technology. And generally, the only exception are for recreational users that are 250 grams or below. But if you're flying commercial Part 107, any weight you have to broadcast. And then for recreational, as long as you're above that 250 gram, you're going to have to broadcast. But there's certain message elements that includes the location of the drone, the pilot or the takeoff location, and such. And what's going to be interesting about this is the compliance rate, I think, especially for some of the ones that would require a broadcast module that would need to be retrofitted. Just monitoring some of the drone social media over the last few days. There's a lot of entities that are really starting to talk about this topic since we're about 2 months away. And there's a lot of talk about, using devices to spoof remote ID locations and such like that. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this evolves. But it was very controversial, and it still continues to be controversial to this day. But from a security standpoint, remote ID is an additional data element that an operator could look at as he or she determines what the potential threat is of the drone. But one thing that remote ID doesn't tell you the intent. It doesn't tell you what they're really up to. And some of those, a lot of people have in conversations, they've talked about how, well, if the drone's not broadcasting remote ID, then it must be a threat. And my first question to them is always, well, how do you know it's not broadcasting remote ID? Because it may be broadcasting, but you're not receiving it. So you can't take your reception or non-reception of remote ID message elements as a determination that it is a threat. You can use it as a data point. And also, if you are receiving message elements, that doesn't mean that they're not complying with all FAA rules and regulations, that they're not flying in restricted airspace or that they might have some sort of nefarious intent. So from a security or operational side of things, it's a data element that you can consider, but it's not, it's not the end all be all data point that you should be using to determine whether or not, what the drone's doing in the airspace.
Sure. And Jacob, do you have anything to add in terms of the legal requirements associated with remote ID compliance and penalties associated with violations?
Yeah, what I'll say is that I think Tom was thorough and detailed about the remote ID requirements and the consequences of using it. What I want to add as a little different point is sort of the additional legal consequences that might arise from the improper use of drone technology that might sort of come as a consequence. In addition, there's tort law that you need to keep in mind, and there's contract law. So tort law is going to be the law that's governing accidents, and even if it's not intentional or willful, an accident that arises as a consequence of your drone technology that sort of damages someone's property or causes actual injury to an individual can be going back to you, and the failure to use remote ID can be a mark against you when determining whether you are at fault for the action. Contract law is another one where you might have a contract to provide goods or services that requires the use of the drone technology, and you might have provisions that state in the contract that your use of the technology is in compliance with all laws and regulations. Your use in compliance with remote ID requirements might be part of that number of considerations that look into when determining whether your contract is valid or not. These are important considerations that you're going to want to keep in mind whenever entering the commercial sector and using technology that is pretty carefully regulated by the government, and the government is keeping a close eye on.
Absolutely. I know there's a lot more that we could all say on these topics, but I want to give us a chance to kind of each go through our lessons learned. So if each of our panelists could go through your top recommendations or takeaways that you have for our audience, that would be a great way to conclude. Trent, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. So one other law I just want to do a shout out for is 18 U.S.C. 1030, which is the Computer Fraud Abuse Act, which is another way we have people attacking a drone. It's going to be violating that, which investigators will be tracking back. The reason I bring this up is a lot of owners and operators of critical infrastructures are used to regulators, and they're used to the concepts of maybe having a plan in place for a cyber attack against their systems. They may not be thinking about when they leverage unmanned, uncrewed vehicles or drones as one of a point of attack, and it may not be in their plan. Number one, always have a plan. Attacks will happen, definitely. Ransomware will happen. So you want to be able to work through this and not be an emergency, but just, the same thing as if you had a fire at your plant, you know what to do if the fire, how to put it out. But go back and take a look at your plans, and to all the owners and operators out there, and you're utilizing these remote edge computers that are wireless. How does that, what risks does that open up to your system? The data that you collect, and as it's transmitted back, so data in transit and then later data in rest, what kind of risks does that promote to your system? That's the things to think about, because that may be an unexpected avenue or opening into your protection. The other question I have is most companies have agreements with outside counsel in case there's an attack for legal advice, and through that they have agreements or retainers with incident response companies that respond to cyber attacks. Ask your counsel and the incident response companies, what about drones? Have you even thought about this? And I think you'd be surprised. I don't know if they're actually thinking about it in the normal playbook. They're used to they're firefighting all the time for the usual attacks, but they may not be seeing that as a vector that they need to keep an eye out for. That's what I'd recommend.
Great, thanks for those takeaways. Tom, what are your top 3 recommendations?
Sure. So from my standpoint, I think being a lifelong learner is really important in this space. You're always going to have to constantly understand how the drone technology is evolving, and then how the tactics, techniques, and procedures you're seeing, employed around the world are going to impact your security measures. The other big thing is, technology is not the only solution. If you're just focused on technology, you're going to miss a big part of some of the things that you can really be doing to protect some of your important assets. And then kind of to jump on a little bit, what having plans or really good policy. Example, one of the things that I was involved with quite a bit when I was working with the FBI and their counter drone program is dealing with things like visual detections, especially at night. Blinking lights of drones can look similar to other low Earth orbit objects and even celestial objects. We've had planets that were mistaken for drones before. So having a good plan, policies, and procedures that you can use to start to build your security procedures for airspace awareness protection.
Those are great. Thanks, Tom. Jacob, over to you.
Thanks, Mary Caitlin, and thank you for moderating this panel. It's been great today. I'm going to go back to have a plan, and I'm going to give some concrete pieces of advice that I found to be really useful when working with other companies on developing plans. First is to make sure that leadership in the company knows the plan, and at best is involved in the development of the plan and in implementing the plan. If there's a cyber attack, you're going to want them to know about it. So you're going to want to make sure that they're involved in the process and handling it. Second, you should have the contact information for everybody that's involved in the plan and everyone that's the backup involved in the plan. It sounds simple enough, but it's great. And it's always very reassuring to just have that contact list in place. When there's a cyber attack, people are stressed, things are unpleasant, it feels rushed. You want to have just that document available to make sure it's easy and accessible and answerable. And then you should practice the plan. Maybe you should even practice the plan once a year and change it as necessary. There are new threats that come up, companies change, departments change, new people are hired, people leave the company, and you want to make sure it's up to date, and your preparedness and your strategy for responding to a plan is just as up to date as the problems and where your company is sitting.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I think we have a couple of minutes left. Don and Mike, I don't know if we received any questions in the chat, but I'll turn it back over to you.
Panel. I mean, even just the last 3-5 minutes here and these tips and lessons learned were really invaluable. So thank you so much. Thanks for everybody out there that watched, and stay tuned, everybody. Make sure you're following my newsletter if you haven't subscribed to that, because you will get notifications of events like this that are pretty exclusive to our community. This will be some of our content is listed as private, but you'll still have access to it. So thanks again, Mary Caitlin, Tom, Jacob, Trent. Great panel. Learned even more than I did the first time, and that's saying something. So that's all she wrote, and we are out here.